Hi, everybody. This is Paula Harris, and we're just starting something new that I really wanted to do for a long time, but I didn't know the right people. This is called UFOs Meet Ancient Aliens. So I reached way back to my Laughlin conferences and reconnected with someone who's living in Glen Rose, Texas, believe it or not, where I had my first all women conference. Uh, Dr. Aaron Judkins was one of my speakers in Laughlin, Nevada, and he has done all kinds of a really good in person field research all over the world. So I thought, let me start with him and let me see if he would connect with me, even though he knows I'm the UFO person. And let's see, number one, we could do a master class. And I told him, especially talk about Gobekli Tepe, even though he's been in search of Noah's Ark. I don't know if you saw my advertisement, but you can talk about it. Start with that, though. Start with it being on Amazon Prime, searching for Noah, so people could go and look at that.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Paula. Yeah. So
Yeah,
uh,
go ahead.
back in
Start. Yeah.
back in 2013, I was invited to go with a team to Eastern Turkey on Greater Ararat to go search for a superstructure on that mountain. And they had made several climbs in the past, but I was never able to get over there. And in 2013, they amassed one of the largest scientific groups to go search a particular area on the mountain. It's called Greater Ararat. It's about 17,000 feet, and yeah, so we went over there, and we had a film crew with us from California, and they documented this this journey of intrepid explorers to step out of their normal lives and go do this thing. And that was in a documentary film that came out in theaters in 2015. It was called Finding Noah. It's narrated by Gary Sinise. One of our producers was Matthew Marsden he's an actor from Black Hawk Down and a number of other movies you would probably know him from. And our director was Brent Baum, who directed The Wedding Planner and several other things. So and we had a very large team. So we had a very large expedition with the scientists, and then we had a very large pretty large crew from the documentary film side. So we had a lot of people going up the mountain. It's up on Amazon Prime for free if you just want to take a look at it. It's about 90 minutes. It'll if you have any interest in that at all, it's just an interesting documentary. It'll show you the journey that we took and some of the extreme conditions it takes to do something like that. It was one of the most hardest things I've ever done in my life, um, but certainly one of the most memorable experiences I think that I've ever undertaken. I've been all around the world and done a lot of work with others like L.A. Marzulli down in Peru, looking at the elongated skulls of the Paracas culture. Been to Bolivia, Tiwanaku, Pumapunka, um, looked at all that, and a number of other places. Done a lot of excavations around the world. Normally, I wear my cowboy hat, um, but I'm traveling. Like I said earlier, I'm out in West Texas, and so I'm not in my normal office at home. But
But going back to that, don't take that away. 17,000 feet is outrageous. Uh, uh,
yeah, it's on up there. Yeah, 3.5 miles up is what that equates to.
what did you find? Do you name? Did it seem like Noah's Ark was there? Can you say anything other than they have to go see it? I mean, what did you find? What was there? I'm curious.
There's a lot of ice. It's a volcanic mountain, um, but it's ice capped at the top from about 15,000 feet up to about 17,000 feet. It's all permanently ice capped in glaciers. So it's not a matter of just simply climbing up and looking around. There's at least an area that's 100 feet, probably more, of ice. And so what we did was we went to a particular area that we used some satellite technology and some of the more modern searches and sightings, and we tried to coalesce all that information together and all that data, and to lead us to a spot on the eastern plateau. And uh, so how do we look around on the ice? Well, you got to look under the ice, which means we had to take ground penetrating radar up there and scan the eastern plateau. And then wherever we saw anomalies, we took ice drills and drilled down uh, until we tried to hit the anomaly. So it was very labor intensive work at 17,000 feet. We only had about 4 good working hours during the day, maybe some, you'd probably get about 5 hours. But it's hard. There's not a lot of oxygen up there. There's 21% oxygen at 17,000 feet. It's just scattered, you know. So it's very difficult to breathe. It's very labor intensive, and sometimes the machines don't want to run that high at that altitude. So there's a lot involved with that. I was the associate producer of the film. I was also one of the archaeologists in the film, and then I tripled up as the team medic. So I had a lot of roles and responsibilities. But it was really an interesting time in my life, and so I was glad to be part of it.
But how did you find the coordinates? I mean, are they in the Bible? I mean, how did you find the
No, the
coordinates?
coordinates were from some of the modern searches and sightings, even going back to the 1940s. And so we tried to take the most credible um, uh, sightings that we could from about the 1940s and maybe the 30s on up uh, to present day. And some of these are pretty credible witnesses, like Colonel Jim Irwin, who was our Apollo astronaut. When Jim Irwin was flying in the military, he flew over Mount Ararat, and he saw what he thought was a superstructure on Ararat. So after he retired out of the military in the Apollo program, he spent the rest of his life dedicated to go back to that area. He took over the course of about 9 or 10 years, but he climbed that mountain about 9 different times. He was very convinced, and of course, Colonel Irwin was already famous for walking on the moon. So anytime he went over, he got a lot of press coverage immediately when he came back into the country, and so that this was back in the 80s and I think maybe the early 90s on his last goes around. He nearly died on the mountain. He fell, and they could not get to him. He was in an area that they just couldn't simply get to him. He had overnight exposed on the mountain. He nearly died, was hospitalized down in Dagobazit for a number of days. He was really beat up just from the fall. But he was really convinced that something was there. And then a young pilot back in those days, his name was Richard Bright, and he teamed up with Colonel Irwin. And then when Colonel Irwin passed away, Richard Bright kind of took the mantle, and that's the team I was on. Now, Richard Bright wasn't in the film, but he has spent about 30 years of his life looking for this, and has climbed the mountain about 30 times. So he's amassed a whole lot of information on this. But one of the questions I get asked a lot is, why would I go and look for something like that? And my answer is, you know, uh, if somebody doesn't go and take up the challenge, we're just not going to know, right? Someone has to be willing to take up the challenge and go do this. And so that's what I like to do as an archaeologist. Is I like to go into the field and just simply try to discover what's out there, and then bring back the data and just let people decide for themselves. And so my job was to independently verify if there was a superstructure on the mountain, and to see what it was. So in the film you'll see how difficult that journey is. It's not an easy task. There's still people, that colleagues of mine, that are still trying to get to other parts of the mountain But look, in 1840, that mountain, there was on the northwest side, um, there was a monastery at about 7,000 feet, and about 200 people lived in that monastery. There was some reports of some artifacts being in that monastery from the Ark. But in 1840, that there was a big earthquake, and it activated that volcano, and it blew out the Ahor Gorge in 1840, which was the northwest side of that mountain. It's deeper than the Grand Canyon on that side, and it buried that monastery under a lot of rubble, and all those people died. So it's a very dangerous place to be, just geopolitically, um, and just being on the mountain. There's a number of dangers. There's a plaque when you get up to about 14,000 feet, which is the last camp, the last stop before you make the push to the summit. There's a plaque up there with at least 50 people who have died trying to get to that spot. That's a plaque I don't want my name on, you know. But it's a very serious. It was a very serious research undertaking, and it took a lot of logistics to make it happen.
Okay, well, start with what you do in real time is you're an EMT on a helicopter, aren't you? But talk about what made you want to go into archaeology. Talk about your current job.
Yeah, so you know, I have a bread and butter career that pays my bills, right? Because archaeology doesn't do it. I wish it would. I just love doing it, um, but it's very difficult to make a living at it. So my bread and butter career is as a flight medic on a 911 air ambulance. And so if you ever been out on the highway and you got stopped in traffic and you've seen helicopters come in, that's what I do. I've done that for a long time. It's very intense training, very difficult training. You know, there's a lot of people in the medical field, but there's about 15,000 of us that just do this specific job across the country. So it's a high performance, high stress level job. And when you get called, when the helicopter gets called, it's serious. It could be anywhere from a trauma to a complicated birth delivery in the fields. It could be anything. And so you really have to train really intensely for that. And so that's what I do full time. But on the side, I do archaeology, and it's taken me all over the world. And I just love it. But I love history. I love learning, and I love researching these mysteries of the past and trying to figure out, you know, what archaeology can fill in the gaps, right? The color of the culture, who, what, when, where, why, you know, and this is part of the journey that led me to Gobekli Tepe. But before I get into that, I guess I should maybe preface with a personal experience that I had. Is that okay, Paula?
Absolutely.
So, you know, I back in 2009, if you remember, there was a UFO sighting. Now we're going to talk about Gobekli Tepe tonight, but I wanted to tell you about this experience that I had that kind of led me into writing this book that I wrote in 2012. Back in 2008, 2009, there was a sighting near Glen Rose, Texas, or Stephenville, Texas. Um, I call it the Stephenville UFO sighting, but look, this sighting was cited by multiple people in the county. Now, if you know anything about Stephenville, it's a farming and ranch community. They're the dairy capital of Texas. They have no interest in UFOs. It's not a UFO thing. They're dairy farmers and they're ranch farmers. You know, they're country folks, and some of the best people in the world you'll meet out there. But look, when this thing happened, there's a nuclear plant where I live in Glen Rose. The county is Somerville County. There's a nuclear plant there. And the sighting occurred right near that nuclear plant and went west towards Stephenville. Um, I did not see it, but I heard reports of it a couple of hours after. But look, very prominent people in the county, which is right next door to me, witnessed it. And I'm talking about like the postmaster, the sheriff's department. Matter of fact, one of the sheriff's officers went on Larry King Live in uniform and described what he saw. So very credible people. Steve Allen, who you may know, who was a pilot, he was out, you know, out in the yard with his friends. He witnessed it. I actually interviewed Steve Allen, And so the reporter that worked at the Stephenville newspaper, and I think it was called the Stephenville Tribune or whatever it's called, it's just a local newspaper there. She started investigating this, but when she started really pressing into the story, she got fired. And I really don't know all the details about it, but back in 2008, 2009, Paula, is that 2009? I can't remember.
It's 2009, and it was Angela Joyner. We gave her a special
Right.
award. Yeah, she lost her job.
Yeah, Angela Joyner, that's right, 2009. Well, back in 2009, they through the Freedom of Information Act, they got the FAA to release the radar reports out of Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. Now, I don't think they do that now. I think that door's been shut, but they did get to release the FAA radar reports from that night, and it shows an object or maybe two that were going at a very high rate of speed, and they scrambled the jets out of Carswell Air Force Base to try to catch it, and they can never catch it. Steve Allen said he saw those lights zooming over, and you know Steve approximated their speed. I don't know how he did it, but he said they were traveling probably 1,800 miles an hour, very very quickly, and so this really caught my attention, and I can tell you that to tell you this. When I was 17, I was out with three of my high school buddies. It was during the summer. I lived in the Texas Panhandle, and we were just hanging out, and we were up over this bluff that kind of overlooked the river that went through our town, and so we would go up there and hang out. And this particular night, it was approaching midnight, and I had a curfew in those days at midnight, so I was kind of getting pressed to get home. But as we were starting down the hill to go back to the truck where we had parked off the highway, my friend Mark, he was an aspiring Air Force Academy guy. He wanted to be a pilot, and he knew everything about planes and all that. That's what he was really wanting to do. And he looked over my shoulder and he said, "Aaron, what is that?" He pointed up over my shoulder, and I said, "Well, come on, let's go, man." I was going to be the last one down, but his eyes were fixated up and above me, just above the horizon. I said, "What are you seeing?" And he goes, "Aaron, look at that." So I look over and I see this ball of red light. It was low on the horizon, floating across. And I said, "But I don't know what that is. Let's go." And he said, "I don't think that's a plane." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well," then he started describing this. He said, "Aaron, there's no blinking lights. It's not making any sound. It was close enough. We should have heard something." And it was moving really slow, just kind of like floating across the horizon, but it was really low. It wasn't up where the airliners were. It was low. And so I got to looking at it. And then we stood there for a couple of minutes, and then we realized, hey, this is unusual. So we called our two friends that had already scrambled down the mountain. We're like, "Hey, come back up here. There's something up here." So we all got up there. We ran across the dirt road to a fence. There was a fence there with a pasture. We ran up to the fence line. We watched it kind of just move out in front of us. And all of a sudden, this thing did maneuvers in the sky very, very quickly, very unique, very sharp angles, very quick movements, at very, very fast speeds. And then it just came to a halt. And I was in complete silence. Matter of fact, all four of us were completely silent. And I remember reaching down, pinching my arm, trying to figure out if I, am I dreaming here? What is this real? What's happening? And it was real. And so we're all staring at this thing, and it did it the second time. It jotted around the sky very, very quickly, very sharp angles, and it came to a sudden stop. And then we're still staring at it. We're just stunned, and we're all in disbelief. Nobody said anything. And then all of a sudden, the thing, it just vanished. Just when it didn't scoot out of the sky, it just simply disappeared and just kind of went away. We're looking at it, then it comes back, and it's still in the kind of the same spot. And so anyway, there were some other things that happened there, but look, that left a question mark in the back of my mind. What did we all see? And then when that 2009 sighting happened near where I live, that thing came up in the back of my mind. What was that when I was 17 years old? What did I see? And here we have numerous witnesses in the Stephenville sighting. So I I started trying to dig into this myself just to answer the question personally, what did I see and what was this thing that people saw back in 2009? And so that led me to Steve Allen, who lived in my area. So I went and interviewed him. And anyway, I wrote a book, not specifically about that event, but just kind of a general thing. But I did include that in my sighting when I was 17. Um, but look, that led me down this journey of the unknown and trying to figure out the mysteries of the past, and that kind of led me down archaeology. And I wanted to understand more about some of these big question marks that we have. And in conventional archaeology, you tend not to get some of those answers. Why? Because some of these are so focused in on their specific fields, they have a hard time broadening out and looking at a bigger picture. And so what I like to do is try to broaden out and look at a bigger picture. And so this is where we're going to kind of step in tonight with the Gobekli Tepe, um, because when I was first introduced to it, it was very intriguing. So this, I'm going to try to figure out how to share my screen. We'll just jump into it. Does anyone have any questions while I'm looking at this?
I don't think you can share your screen. I have to,
Oh yeah, Paula, get it to where I can share my screen and
I don't know how to do it with somebody else, so.
let's see. There
'Cause
should be, let's see, there should be a share button on top. Let me think.
I can share mine, but I can't share, let's see. But I already showed them the book when so could you do it without because we're going to say, look, I'm going to tell everybody that Aaron will be with us May 22nd to 24th, 2026, where he will do a PowerPoint in Crestone, because we're going to start doing some of this UFO meets ancient aliens. So don't
Yeah,
feel,
so I'll just go through it. Do y'all know what Gobekli Tepe is and what it's about? Or has anyone heard about Gobekli Tepe?
so just go ahead and talk to them about it, because it's the first time I've done ancient aliens.
Yeah. So y'all can speak up and answer. It's fine. Has anyone heard about it, or are you familiar with the term Gobekli Tepe or the site?
I am. I've read a lot about it and been
Okay.
watching over it for a year now.
Okay. Anyone else?
Do that in a recording. We can't do it in a recording because this is going to go on YouTube. So I would
Yeah.
need everybody to sign something. They can ask questions at the end.
Okay.
Those
Yeah.
I can't
So I'll just
edit it. I can't edit it. So go ahead and talk about it, and then we're going to leave you an hour to talk to everybody.
yeah. So we'll just talk about it. So Gobekli Tepe is a site in southeastern Turkey, and it was discovered by a farmer that owned the land. He was plowing his field and he hit a big stone there, and he jumped off to try to dig this out, and he realized that it was massive. He just caught the corner angle of it. He went to the archaeologist in Shanlurfa, and uh, and Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who was working there at the time in the 90s, mid 90s, he had just wrapped up a dig in the region, and so he had heard about this, so he had went over to take a look at it. In the 1960s, Gobekli Tepe was mis-surveyed as a Byzantine cemetery. But when Klaus got there to the site, he realized it wasn't Byzantine at all. It's actually Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic specifically. So he realized this was a really important site, and he began excavations there, I think, in the mid 90s. And this is where we really start opening up with Gobekli Tepe. The reason Gobekli Tepe is important, matter of fact, in Turkish, Gobekli Tepe means potbelly hill or navel hill. So Tepe in Turkish is a hill, and then Gobekli actually means the navel or the potbelly part. So you're literally saying navel hill. This is kind of the birthplace of where this site is. and it's right on the edge of the fertile. It's right in the Fertile Crescent, but it's right on the edge of the plains of Haran. Now, this is back in back at the time of Gobekli Tepe. It was really a fertile crescent there. You had ample grains there that grew in the plains of Haran. So the wild wheat, two different types of wheat, Eichhorn and Einhorn wheat, and then you had wild barley, and then you had a lot of game in that area, wild boar, antelope, these ancient auroch bulls, cows that lived there. And so there was a lot of food resources and water for them there. So when they started looking at Gobekli Tepe, something amazing happened, because in archaeology, Gobekli Tepe, when they teach in archaeology that man began this sedentary life because of people came together and they formed communities, and that formed into small areas that people would gather, and then they formed kind of defensive positions to protect themselves and their food supply, and then so basically basically life really started beginning, agriculture, and then towards the end of all that, religion came into play. But something happened when they started excavating Gobekli Tepe, and what they realized was Dr. Klaus Schmidt realized that Gobekli Tepe turns all that model upside down. Why? Because you have the first megalithic architecture in the pre-pottery Neolithic, which is before the invention of pottery, that is in the Stone Age. Now that's not supposed to be there. So in this time period, this is where supposedly the Stone Age man still was hunter gatherers. They had no technology, no knowledge, no skills to be able to build megalithic architecture. But here it is in full view, and it's megalithic architecture, right? It's these big T-stone column pillars. And they found the quarry site, it's about a quarter of a mile away. And they cut these stones out in a monolithic fashion, which means it's all in one solid piece. They drug them uphill a quarter of the mile away, and then they set them in the bedrock, which is pretty fascinating. What this shows that it shows that organization, it shows a division of labor, and it shows that Stone Age man wasn't how they had been mischaracterized. It actually is. They were actually had some kind of some kind of an advanced knowledge to be able to do this. That's not supposed to be in the Stone Age. So it really kind of blew that theory out of the water. But here it is. And what they began to realize was that it was a huge complex. I'm talking 22 acre site, and it was all buried. They're enclosures, they're circular or oval enclosures that are encompassed with T columns around them. And in the center of an enclosure D were two central T stone pillars that are 18 and a half foot tall. Now, it took them 10 years to excavate enclosure D alone. So it's very slow process. I think they have 5 enclosures excavated, but look, only about 10% of Gobekli Tepe has actually been excavated. And this is since the 90s. So it's a very slow process. It's a lot of rock. And they, of course, they have to catalog everything as they go. But enclosure D was one of the first ones they got to, which was a very amazing thing because of these 18 and a half foot tall T pillars that were central in enclosure D. Now they're enclosed by another 12 or 13 of the smaller T columns, but they have zoomorphic images on them. What is zoomorphic? Zoomorphic is animal images. They all seem to represent Holocene animals, like from the Ice Age. So tigers or lions. You have fox. You have a number of serpents. You have scorpions. You have vultures. You have a number of different animals, but they're animals that can hurt you, sting you, bite you, or probably kill you, which is interesting. Now, when I first heard about Gobekli Tepe, matter of fact, I referenced it in my first book, An Alien Agenda. Um, but I didn't quite understand what Gobekli Tepe was. I kind of had a preconception about it in my mind because in close proximity to Mount Ararat, which is hundreds of miles away. But I was asked by someone who follows my work. He's a guy out of Canada, and he asked me several times to take a look at it. And when he asked me, he said, "Have you heard about it?" I said, "Yes, I've heard about it, but I don't really know a whole lot about it." And he goes, "Aaron, you got to take a look at this." And I was super busy, and I said, "There's just no way I can take a look at it. It's just, it's going to take a lot of my time. I just don't have a lot of time to dedicate to doing something new." But as he said, "Look, just take a look at it and see what you think, and just but really just take some time to look at it." So, I was doing an interview on Fade to Black with Jimmy Church years and years ago, and Jimmy had asked me. He sent me a picture, and he goes, "What do you think this is?" It was one of those columns in Enclosure D, and he said, "I think this is a belt." And I said, "That's not a belt. I mean, I've seen a lot of rocks, and rocks tend to have shapes that they kind of look like something. It's like looking up in the clouds, and you can imagine, a shape of something, right? Rocks can do the same thing. They can trick you." And so I said, that's not a belt. That's just decorative design. But when I went back to take a look at it, I realized I was wrong. That was a belt. And then I realized these are anthropomorphic images on both of these T-column pillars, and that blew my mind. So I said, "Wait a minute, there's something happening here that's different." So this led me down a 5-year journey research of writing this book on Gobekli Tepe. And incidentally, I went back on Jimmy Church's show on Fade to Black, and I told Jimmy, I said, "Look, remember when you sent me that?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "Look, I was wrong." And he goes, "No kidding." I said, "Yeah, that is a belt because they're anthropomorphic images." So what's anthropomorphic? That means it's human-like images on these T pillars. They're faceless, but look, they have arms that wrap around to the side. Their hands come to the navel. They are wearing a belt because in front is a fox pelt loincloth that those things are wearing. That's very interesting. Then you couple that with the other imagery like the zoomorphic imagery and so on. So this really intrigued me. So as I began to research, I took my approach. Now I'll back up and tell you this one thing. When I was back in 2011, 2012, a guy had asked me to research some Paleo Hebrew in the desert of New Mexico. Now there should be no Paleo Hebrew script in the desert in New Mexico, anywhere in the North America. But he showed me some photos. He said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, it looks like Paleo Hebrew, but I don't. Why would it be out there?" That's the big question. So what did the maverick archaeologist go do? I went to New Mexico and I looked at this thing. So I spent a good year making multiple trips out to the site. It's called the Los Lunas Mystery Stone or Hidden Mountain there. And so I went out to Hidden Mountain near the village of Los Lunas, and I found it's also known as the Decalogue Stone. So it's in Paleo Hebrew. It's an abridged version of the Ten Commandments. So I said, "What is this doing out here? That's weird." So when I started going out there, I made trips to Santa Fe, to the library. I went to the archaeological museum in Albuquerque, interviewed archaeologists. So I was really digging in to try to find out what this was. One of the approaches that I used was I kind of zoomed out, and I wanted to see the context of the area. And one of the approaches that I took was, well, what else is around this area? Is there any other context that matches it? And the answer is no. Some people thought that it was the Battalion of Mormon. So I checked into that. The Battalion of Mormon did go through that area, but they did not go by Hidden Mountain. One thing they did is they kept very detailed records. And back in the 1950s, when they heard about it, they sent a guy out there to look at, and he said, "This wasn't us. We didn't come through this area. We don't know what this is, but it's not us." So we ruled that out pretty quickly, and that was actually done in the 1950s by them. But what my angle was is I try to zoom out and get a more of an aerial approach about context, and that's how I solved the Los Lunas Mystery Stone. Some people say it's the oldest version of the Ten Commandments, and it's by the Phoenicians who got out here. There's a whole lot of theories about that, but I can tell you that it's not any of those things. I'll let you go and read it if you want to on my Substack. If you go to aaronjudkins.substack.com, I've got it in there in an article. Or if you go to academia.edu, I've got it there in on the academia site. But so I thought I'm going to take the same approach with Gobekli Tepe. And when I kind of zoomed out and took like this aerial 35,000 foot view of the region and looked at context, then I realized it's just not Gobekli Tepe, but there's multiple sites around this region that have the same context. I'm talking Karahan Tepe, which is nearby, Çatalhöyük, Kayun, a number of other places that are near there. And what I thought was very interesting was that they had the very similar architecture and features at these neighboring sites. And it really began to draw some parallels about the architecture, because again, they are similar with the T-pillar construction sites. Now, it's not all like Gobekli Tepe, but there's anthropomorphic images. There are these stone faces, and there's these zoomorphic images. But something else that I noticed was that there was a lot of iliophallic imagery at these other sites. And what I thought was interesting is, why would they portray these anthropomorphic images that are clearly dead? And I'm talking about they're displaying anthropomorphism with these images like at Karahan Tepe, one in particular where it's showing its ribs, but phallic imagery as well. And then you have other things associated with that. And I thought it was also interesting that their hands came around to the navel. Now, if you think about it, if you remember Easter Island and those big stone statues over there, their hands wrap around to the navel. If you go to Indonesia, you have the same anthropomorphic stones, their hands wrap around to the navel. If you go to Bolivia, when I was in Bolivia, some of these stones, their hands wrap around to the navel. So we have different cultures separated by time and distance, but a very similar imagery, hands wrapping around in the navel. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So as I began to really dig into this, I thought, what is the imagery about? What does it represent? What does the zoomorphic animals represent? Why would they put that on there? And what are these other symbols? Now, if you remember on that belt imagery on Gobekli Tepe in Enclosure 9, there's these kind of English H-looking symbols. They're not English lettering, and there's some that looks like an eye, and there's some other things. What in particularly caught my interest was it's called a logogram, and it was a logogram symbol that I had recognized from another culture. This logogram is a very well-known documented logogram in archaeology, and it's from the Luvian culture. The Luvians were contemporaneous with the Hittites, but there's a Luvian logogram on the stone at Gobekli Tepe, not in Enclosure D, it was one of the other enclosures. But it's now what is a logogram? A logogram is a symbol that represents a word. So one of the things that the Luvians did was they had just an everyday spoken language and a written language, but they also had a formal language that they used to write formally on monumental stone. Why? Because you have limited space on stone. If you're going to use that stone to write on, you want to make it count. You don't want to use up a bunch of space, right? So they used logograms for specifically for formal writing because one logogram can represent a whole word. So this logogram on the stone at Gobekli Tepe was the logogram for Deus. This is a Latin term, Deus, which means God. Now that's interesting because now we're talking about the pre-pottery Neolithic, and now we have this logogram on the stone. Now, Luvian logogram, there's not a lot known about the Luvian culture. There's very few archaeologists and linguists who understand Luvian, but not all the logograms have been deciphered. A lot of them have been, but some of them haven't been. And so what we see is that some of these logograms were I identified at Gobekli Tepe. So that symbol, the H-looking symbol, that logogram in Luvian logogram is the symbol for portal or for gate. The one with an I, that's a Luvian logogram that's a symbol for temple or house. So I thought that's really interesting. So as I began to look at this, I began to formulate kind of a theory about what's happening at Gobekli Tepe. Initially, archaeologists thought that they came to the site and then they had some kind of, there's numerous archaeological evidence that they had ritualistic feasting. They came to the site, they had this huge megalithic kind of feast, if you will, and then they thought that they left. Evidence shows now that they actually lived at the site. It wasn't a site where they just came and left. Why? Because they found 3 human burials under the floors, which is some rectangular structures next to these oval enclosures. This is very common practice in the Neolithic, where they buried their dead under the floor in a fetal position. This is very common in an area very kind of in that region called Chattahoochee. It's very well documented since the 50s and 60s. It's excavated, and the people there are Neolithic, not perhaps pre-pottery, but they are Neolithic Stone Age. And the people who lived in this community probably were up to about 9 or 10,000 people who lived there. And they buried the dead under the floors of their home. We found 3 of those burials at Gobekli Tepe, just like the ones at Chattahoochee, which is interesting. Chattahoochee's thousands of years down the road, but we see the same commonality and practices at Gobekli Tepe. So we know that they lived at the site full time, and we know that they have plenty of food sources and natural resources there. What's intriguing is what were they doing in these enclosures? Because it wasn't an area where they lived. It was considered sacred space. And why was it considered sacred space? It's because the sacred space, the floors were actually plastered, the walls were plastered. And this was an area, matter of fact, and in some of these enclosures, there was a procession that you walked into, and there was bench seating around it. In the midst of enclosure D, then you have these 2 anthropomorphic images that are 18 and a half foot tall. Now, they were probably roofed in those days. They're open to the sky now, but they were probably enclosed and underground, or at least enclosed with roofs, which means that when you went in there, it was dark. Look, when you went in there with probably some torch lights, those torch lights probably casted shadows of that imagery on the floors and on the walls. And when you do that, pardon me, let me, okay. When you do that, that's similar. The people in the Neolithic thought everything in nature around them was tied to their cosmology. So they believed that the cycles of the sun and the moon and the day and the night and the seasons, all that had to do with their cosmological belief in the afterlife. And they believed it so much that they practiced it in everyday life. So in the planting in the spring and in the harvesting in the fall and in the winter, that represented death. And so they they projected that imagery in their belief system. So when you're going in there with the torchlight into these enclosures, that light would cast shadows probably on the floors and the walls. And the imagery of the shadows that are projected from the stones then becomes symbology imagery. And in other words, the stones seem to come up to life when you're casting these types of shadows. So they were probably doing something very, some kind of ceremonial or libation ceremony or ritual in these enclosures. Why? Because they found shallow stone vessels in the center of one of the enclosures. And so we think that they were probably having some kind of a ceremonial aspect in these enclosures. Again, sacred space for a special purpose, set aside for a special function. And so when you kind of tie all this together and you look at it, and look, after 5 years of research, I came up with a couple of theories on this. One I've talked about is called the Luvian logogram theory, which means that I'm identifying language on the stones at Gobekli Tepe. Now, the traditional dating is pre-pottery Neolithic, before the invention of pottery and before the invention of writing, before the invention of the wheel. But yet, I think I've identified writing on the stones at Gobekli Tepe, which means that those are not simple art motifs on the side of the stones, it's language. If it's language, then we definitely have to take another look at Gobekli Tepe. Two is a theory called the regeneration theory. And that regeneration theory is based in their cosmology of life after death. And so they believe that when you died, that you went to the netherworld first, but then after the netherworld, for you to become an ancestor, your father ancestors who went back to the stars, there was a process that you had to go through. And so probably what happened in these enclosures, they found some skull fragments in some of these enclosures. Some of the skull fragments had holes drilled through them. I think probably what happened was you don't need the whole body, but you could simply take one of the skulls of your loved ones who had died, and to assist them to get to the afterlife, they drilled holes through the skull so they could suspend them somehow. And that would help your ancestor or your loved one journey back to the afterlife. So there was a regeneration that occurred. So part of the symbology of this was the ethiophalic imagery that we see at Gobekli Tepe and the region. And we see this often with the anthropomorphism of the sides of the ribs, which means that, and headless imagery, by the way, that we see, but with phallic imagery of headless people. Now, we know that there's, once you're dead, and you're all dead. You're not, that's it, right? But yeah, we have phallic imagery on headless imagery on stones of Gobekli Tepe, showing ribs. This is showing life after death. So they're portraying their belief on the stones. And this is why they used logograms to depict what's happening on the stones. So I think one of the things that they had done was they had deified their ancestors. Now, this is not new in cultures. Japan still practices this. Some cultures in South and Central America practice not really deification, but they practice in a looser sense of the term ancestor worship. You'll see some in South Central America that will come and their mummified ancestors, they'll pull them out like once a year and they'll take pictures with them, and you can pull it up on Google. So we see some of this still practicing today. I think the people in the Neolithic had deified their ancestors. And through the imagery that we see on the stones, at least in a veneration way, that they were using that to help their loved ones get back to through the netherworld, back to the stars, because I think they believed that they had come from the stars. one of the reasons is because when they viewed the skies, uh, I mean, you're looking at a velvet sky with these, kind of diamond sprinkled stars. They knew about constellations. And I think one of the things that they were looking at was perhaps some of the constellations. Now, other people had other theories about Cygnus and other things, how they aligned. Um, I think perhaps they were looking at the constellation of Orion or perhaps the dog star Sirius near the constellation of Taurus. Why? Because the people of the Neolithic were known as the people of the bull. And one of the things they did, they just didn't deify their ancestors. I think what happened was they had deified everything in nature around them. So they had deified the moon specifically, and they had deified the bull. One represents the powers over the heavens. The bull represented the most powerful animal that was in their area, and that was that giant Ararat bull. It probably took a dozen men to take one of these bulls down. They were very, very large. So one was representing the power over the heavens. The other was representing the powers over the earth. We know this in archaeology that they did actually deify the moon. Not only, I think, at Gobekli Tepe, and I'll tell you why here in a second, but 9 miles away is modern day Şanlıurfa. Şanlıurfa before it was Şanlıurfa, it was just Urfa. And this was an area where they did practice moon worship. And another area that is contemporaneous with Gobekli Tepe is the area of Jericho. And we know the area of Jericho practiced moon worship. Oftentimes in archaeology, in these regions, we see two males flanking a crescent moon in worship of the moon god. Now, in the Akkadian culture, they deified the moon god as the moon god Sin. This is a very prominent practice in that area of the world, not just at Jericho and Şanlıurfa or old Urfa. It was biblical Edessa, but also in other areas. I think this is what's happened at Gobekli Tepe, and here's why. On those two anthropomorphic images, in enclosure D, you have the Eastern Pillar 18, you have Western Pillar 31. I'm doing all this by memory. But on Eastern Pillar 18, where I remember they're faceless, but up about where the neck is right here, there's two standards. One is a crescent moon, one is a disc above that, and above that is that letter looking H. Now, it's not an H. When you really look at it, it looks more like two people that are standing in profile, kind of holding hands. This is, again, a logogram in Luwian that would represent, the H would represent portal or gate. Now, this is interesting because the crescent standard, coupled with the disc, which was either a full moon disc or a sun disc, and I think perhaps it was probably a sun disc, because when you couple those together, that's known as a crescent star. And that crescent star was practiced in other cultures. Now, symbolism doesn't change throughout cultures. Most of the time, symbols remain the same in cultures. So one symbol that represents something over here remains consistent and the same. So we see this crescent star standard in Acadia, in the Akkadian symbology later. This is very well documented in the archaeological record, and yet we have a crescent star symbol on the motif on Eastern Pillar 18, which means that crescent star standard is representing female deity. It was later on associated with Venus and some other things, but it always represented female. It represented divinity. It represented fertility. And so this is what you have on the crescent standard on Eastern Pillar 18. On Western Pillar 31, right next to it, you have another crescent standard, and that's the crescent standard of the bull. Now, the people of the Neolithic were known as people of the bull. And Çatalhöyük, they have bull imagery in their houses. Just like if you had a longhorn steer kind of mounted up on your wall, there's a lot of them here in Texas. Um, it's the same thing. Some of these over time had started to age and fall apart, and they plastered the skulls. And there was numerous places in the houses. Now their houses, they would go up through the roof. They were often underground, so they would go up through the roof, and you would come down a ladder into the house. Either in a corner of the house or in one of the walls, they had several of these skulls, of these bull skulls with the horns in the homes. So we know that they had deified this imagery of the bull. On Western Pillar 31, you have the imagery of the bull crescent on there, which means that Gobekli Tepe had two representations of deities, I think, that they had venerated in enclosure D. One of the enclosures represents the sky god An, and the other enclosure, Western Pillar 31, is a deification of the sky god An. This is in Sumerian, the pantheon. When you look at the Anunnaki were birthed from the sky god An, A-N. An was the highest in the Sumerian pantheon. He was considered the sky god, and in Sumerian, in the language of in the Sumerian, A means father or ancestor. In Sumerian means to lift up on high or to place on the highest. So when you're saying An, the sky god An, you're literally saying the sky god who's placed on the highest or in the heights. So this was at the top of the Sumerian pantheon. Then you have the other seven that kind of birthed out of that. This is the deification of these two imageries that we see on the stones at Gobekli Tepe in Enclosure D. So part of the theory that I'm not saying that that's 100%, I'm saying it's a theory, but this is some of the theories that I'm presenting in the book. It's called Decoding Gobekli Tepe. It's up on Amazon. It trended #1 in archaeology and in prehistory for months on Amazon. It's relatively new. It came out about 6 months ago. And it's the 5 years of research that I've accumulated over that period of time with all the footnotes and references in one book. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. This is the first time I think a lot of this resource information has been really put together in one single volume. I combed through a lot of material, and I got a nugget here, and then I blanked out, and I got a little nugget here. But as I began to piece this together, I saw some of that imagery, and I realized that imagery is not just art, it's language, and they're specifically telling us something. They're telling us about some of the things that they did there. And I think what I would like to see is there's just a handful of experts in Luvian. Some of them are at the it used to be called the Oriental Institute at Chicago. Now I think it's called the Ancient. I can't remember now. It's Ancient Cultures something. They renamed it, but it used to be called the OI. And there's at least one professor there that knows Luvian. But what I would like to do is, and I cite the Luvian sources in the book so you can see it. But what I would like for someone to do, because I'm not versed in Luvian, it's not, like I said, it's not fully deciphered. A lot of the symbology is not even known. There's no context for it yet. But look, in 1943, when I talked about kind of broadening out and looking at a bigger picture, in 1943, at a neighboring site, it's called Kara Tepe. Now, don't confuse that with Karahan Tepe. It's Kara Tepe. In 1943, archaeologists discovered something interesting on the stones at Kara Tepe, and that is Luvian logograms, which is interesting because I've identified Luvian logograms on the stones at Gobekli Tepe, which means that's language on the stones. Language on the stones should not be there if it's Stone Age. So now we have a chronology issue here. So there's a lot that we don't know about Gobekli Tepe yet. But I think what I've pieced together at least brings to um, it brings to light some questions that we need to ask. And some of these questions are, is what we know um, accurate? Because the science of archaeology and the science of really anything is to ask, questions. And I think that we should be still asking questions about the site of Gobekli Tepe. Remember, roughly 10% has been excavated. Now they have slowed down excavations there at the site. There's some other things happening. Information's really slow getting out of there. But I think we have to ask some questions about, is this language on the stones,
Yeah.
and what does the purpose of the site, and what does these anthropomorphic images mean? So I get into all this in the book. I kind of walk you through it. And of course, you can, I just present it. I want you to make up your own mind. But it's very interesting because we go back to the very, very beginnings of our past, and we see something that we shouldn't be seeing at Gobekli Tepe. One is megalithic architecture, two is language, and three is that it wasn't agriculture that brought them together at Gobekli Tepe, and then everything else. It was religious ideology that brought the people together first. And that is what is kind of topsy turvy. And not only Gobekli Tepe, but the neighboring sites, because we see the same imagery, we see the same architectural style, we see the same sacred spaces, we see the same, the same cosmology at these neighboring sites. And so I think perhaps it's not, it's not
I
separate.
see some room for some questions because we're over the hour.
Yeah,
So
let's take some questions.
that you want to take a group to Gobekli Tepe, right? You want to do a tour. You had told me that you were
Yes.
what do you want to do the tour in?
Yeah, so we're trying to get some interest up with a tour of Turkey. Turkey. I've been to Turkey. Obviously, when I talked to you earlier about being over there in 2013, Turkey's a really wonderful place. There's a lot of ancient history in Turkey that most people aren't aware of. It's a fabulous place to go. We would like to go take a large group and go to, of course, flying to Istanbul, and then go to sites like Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Anatolia, which is kind of centrally, it's the capital. They have a wonderful museum at Ankara there. Go to the Black Sea, go to Cappadocia, just see some of these really wonderful sites there that I haven't even seen a lot of the sites over there. But one of the things I would love to do is get over to Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and look at these sites and see the stones for themselves. So we're looking at possibly a trip, maybe next year, maybe 2027, but we certainly are looking at taking a group of folks who want to go and that's interested in the site over in Turkey.
All right, but how can they reach you? Can you give an email to everybody?
Yeah, I'll give you my website. It's aaronjudkins.com. And just go there. You can contact me there, or you can contact me through Substack. It's aaronjudkins.substack.com. And so I write a lot of articles and things there. Those are the two primary ways to get a hold of me. If you want to go over to, I have a Patreon site. It's called Ancient Pathways over Patreon. I have a lot of free content over there for people. I've got some content for members, but there's just a lot of resource information that I just amassed over the years and the decades of all my research. Stuff on giants, stuff on the Paracas skulls, and just a bunch of different things. I've got some ancient libraries that I had amassed over the years that I've put together in digital volumes, ancient text volumes. If you're interested in giants, I got a lot of information on that. These are PDFs of just ancient text and things that I've amassed over the years. That's just all in one source for you. So it's really convenient. And I just wanted to make that available for folks. who have a research interest or just an interest for their knowledge. So I just try to make it convenient for folks who want to look and research for themselves. But I just enjoy doing, all this work and, bringing all this information. Again, Gobekli Tepe took me, about 5 years of research in this book called Decoding Gobekli Tepe. I co-authored it with a friend of mine named Dr. Judd Burton. But we get into some other areas in the book, which you may find fascinating, but that's how you can get a hold of me, AaronJudkins.com.
I understand, so people know they can get a hold of you. Plus, you're going to be with us May 22nd to May 24th in Crestone, which you're going to love Crestone. It's a beautiful
place. Yeah.
So I'm going to end the recording here, and then that will allow other people to ask you questions, and they won't be on the recording. So thank you so much for being with us. It's so interesting.
You're welcome.
That share screen, but we'll save all that for Crestone.